Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our Success Center webinar focused on equity-minded online teaching for Ohio's community colleges and our students. We've been running a number of these webinars over the last few months, and we have appreciated your engagement and your thoughtful questions and comments throughout the sessions. And so we're really in for a special session this afternoon on a very important topic that has been something that we've been working on over the last year and want to do so more intentionally now as our communities and our students are responding to a number of different crises across Ohio and across the country. So we reached out to the University of Southern California Center for Urban Education in, I think it was April, coming soon after the COVID-19 crisis, and asked about the opportunity to partner on some webinars. And they responded immediately that they would be willing to do that with us. And so this is the first of what could be more opportunities to come. And we felt like this topic, again, was really particularly important as we very quickly moved to online and remote instruction during the spring semester, and now face the reality that that's probably going to continue to be our mode of operation, either fully or in some part as we move forward. And so I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers, Dr. Marissa Wheaton, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the USC Center for Urban Education, and Dr. Jennifer Ortiz, who is the chair of the English department and faculty member at Los Angeles Trade Tech. And so we have, again, a great session planned. We hope you are engaged. Please use the chat box to say hello and respond to questions that are thrown out. And you can also post more formal questions in the Q&A. If you do use the chat, a little Zoom trick, make sure that you're sharing with everyone and not just the panelists so that we can all be engaged in the conversation. And so with all that, I didn't ever say my name. I feel like I've done so many of these with you guys that I forget that step, but I'm Laura Rittner, Executive Director of the Success Center. And again, we're just so happy to be with all of you today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marissa and Jennifer.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Before we get started, we certainly wanted to thank Laura and Garrett for hosting this and inviting us to join you all. We are thrilled to be a part of this. It looks like you all are doing amazing work under extreme conditions, and so we really just appreciate the invite and how smooth everything has been as we prepare. So as we transition, I will have my co-presenter, Jennifer, share her screen. And what I want to say is, again, my name's Marissa Wheaton. I use she, her pronouns. I work with the Center for Urban Education. And I guess I'll just start with saying, no one could have anticipated the crisis and limitations that we've encountered this year. And I know as an instructor myself, I've had to learn as I go and evaluate my teaching practices with students on the spot. And for that reason, I'm co-facilitating with this session with Jennifer, who is an experienced equity-minded teacher and scholar. And more specifically, she has taught online for 8 years and is Canvas certified. Let me see. So we do have this up, and we can actually move to the next slide. This is before we realized we were going to have an introduction, but if you all could actually just, we invite you to share your name, your institution, just let us know who's here in the room with us. We would love to have some engagement throughout the session. And also, we do have our Twitter names available, so we welcome you to tweet at us, and to use, if you hear anything that you enjoy, use the hashtag #QRacialEquity. We hope that we can continue this conversation online. And again, we will be using the comment box throughout to kind of ask you all some questions, but also we definitely invite you all to ask questions through the Q&A box. As we move along throughout the presentation, that's where we will go to see what questions you have throughout. So before we get started, I did want to set some foundation for why this discussion is critically important right now. So as we know, COVID-19 has disproportionately affected minoritized communities. The economic and social conditions that our Black, Latinx, Native American, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian students experience makes them vulnerable in a number of ways. And as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley recently stated in a forum on Black student debt, we have to move with urgency. The aftermath of COVID-19 is not only illuminating disparities that have long existed, but the circumstances we're now encountering are further widening the racial equity gap. We also can't ignore the blatant racism that persists. In addition to anti-Asian sentiment that has been coupled with COVID-19, our students are witnessing anti-Blackness, particularly as we think about the recent murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and of course, George Floyd's death, who, recently sort of started a movement for Black lives. And not to mention the countless missing Black people in the wake of our current movement for Black lives. So we know that these are not isolated incidents, and they're just examples that demonstrate the terrorism that many people of color have to navigate every single day. So as we respond to this current crisis, we can see why racial equity cannot simply be an add-on, but must be baked in and embedded into our institutions and everyday practices. So I wanted to sort of share those opening remarks. I'm also going to be providing some quick definitions, but as you can see here on the screen, we do have an agenda. We're gonna, we're sort of doing our warm up now as you all share where you're from. Thank you so much for joining us. I see all of you have shared your institutions. Of course, we just acknowledged the current context that we're in, and Jennifer is going to be providing some really powerful tools that she has generated over the years as it relates to equity in her virtual classrooms. And of course, we'll have Q&A throughout. So we can move to the next slide. Yeah. So one thing in addition to your sharing your institutions is we'd love for you to share the one most vital value in your life. So as we know, a value is something that defines who you are and what you believe is most important. We would love, as we're moving through this presentation, to know what that value might be for you. And of course, we'll circle back to what that means and how you can incorporate that into your classroom later on in the presentation. So I see that Loletta says value for me is honor. So thank you so much for starting that conversation. So you can continue to add that in, and we'll move to the next slide, which I believe is it definitions? Oh, well, of course, why don't I first invite my co-presenter, Jennifer, to start the conversation about values, and also, of course, introduce herself and why she does this work.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I was actually just mentioning to the coordinators of this webinar that these types of webinars are my favorite because I get a chance to exchange with other practitioners. And I think considering that what's going on in the world right now, it's just so important that we're talking to each other and seeing how we can be there and best support our students. So, I guess I'll start to introduce myself by talking about one of the values that I believe make, build who I am, who Jennifer is. And for me, it's justice. And a lot of the work that I do, even before I became a college professor, was in the social justice movement. So I did some work with the non-proliferation movement. I was in the labor movement for a long time as well. And then I transitioned into a whole new career, which is a teacher. And, it's really important that topics or the value of justice, is echoed and communicated in all of my curriculum. And a lot of this work, this equity-minded teaching practices, for me is tied to who I am and what my value is.
Awesome. So we we've acknowledged our context. And now I want to just quickly go over some shared definitions and language, just so that you all are aware in case it comes up throughout the presentation. So, we really draw from Ibram X. Kendi's work. I have the book right here, actually. Might as well show it. This is a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I'd highly encourage you to read it. But he says that racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produce and normalize racial inequities. So really thinking about how policies are manifested through our ideas. And if we don't challenge our ideas, then we're going to continue to perpetuate those inequities. So Q really uses these principles of racial equity in general, but racial equity is what we really focus on in our center. So the first is that equity is a means of corrective justice for the educational debt owed to descendants of enslaved people and other minoritized populations who have been excluded from higher education historically. Of course, equity is an anti-racist project, so it's actively working against historical racism and present racism. And equity lets practitioners see whiteness as a norm that operates through structures, policies, and practices. So oftentimes we think, that we don't think of whiteness as being pervasive in the way that we operate, but in fact, it is actually truly embedded in everything that we do because it's embedded with that power. And so it's important for us from the Center for Urban Education to really highlight those principles as we work towards and strive towards racial equity. So who is equity-minded? Again, we draw this from a book called Equity Talk and Equity Walk. I might as well show that book too. I didn't plan on this, but I might as well show it. It's a great book. It just came out in 2020. Our fierce founder and director, Estela Ben-Simon, is one of the authors. And so they say that who is equity-minded? A practitioner or faculty member who is willing to assess their own racialized assumptions, to acknowledge their lack of knowledge in the history of race and racism, to take responsibility for the success of historically underserved and minoritized student groups, and to critically assess racialization in their own practices as educators and or administrators. So really taking ownership and responsibility for your agency as a faculty member or campus leader, and to think about the fact that you're never going to know all the answers, but it's important to actively take that responsibility every single day and to constantly reassess how you may be, perpetuating the same inequities in your work with students. So we can move to the next slide. So, Ibram Kendi says, who is anti-racist? One who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea, of course. And to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right or inferior or superior with any racial group. So we have to sort of think about the ways that we stereotype particular groups and assume why they may or may not be performing well in a classroom, and think about how you yourself as an agent of change can reevaluate your own practices and think about how you can change those patterns. So of course, none of us want to think of ourselves as someone who is racist or discriminatory, but we have all been socialized in particular ways to believe right and wrong and to believe what makes sense. And so it's important to just constantly be thinking about how to unlearn a lot of the norms that we've been taught. And so in this particular context, we just like to share that it can be difficult to focus on racial equity in a time of crisis. However, it's important that, we think about the fact that implicit bias tends to occur more often under intense circumstances like what we are under right now in the context of COVID-19 and lots of racial injustice. And so when you're under stress, when you have limited information, when you have a lot of of time crunch and pressure, that's when we make quick decisions and our implicit bias comes out. And so it's important that we check that and be mindful of that, particularly in these moments. And so for that reason, we're super grateful to be here and sort of share some of the ways that we try to address that in these conditions. So the last slide that I'll share before I pass this on to Jennifer, who is really going to give you the meat and potatoes of this presentation, is our equity-minded versus deficit-minded chart that Q really uses. And I'm not going to go through each one, but essentially, you know, an equity-minded competence is about awareness of racial identity, uses disaggregated data to identify patterns, and so whether that be in your classroom, in your policies and practices at an institution, and you're constantly reflecting on the consequences of taking for granted practices. So the things that we don't think about just because, you know, a lot of times we just do things because we've always done it, as opposed to, hang on, let's revisit whether or not this is actually serving everyone in the way that we intend for it to. And what deficit-minded competence really does is constantly attribute the blame to the student or to the person who has been historically underserved. And so we want to make sure that we really move towards equity-minded competence. And we'd be happy to share this resource in particular for those of you who might be interested in sort of embedding it in your practice. So with that said, I'm going to pass this over to you, Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. So before I get started, I want to cover, I'm going to share some new curriculum with you and also tell you a little bit about a story of where I felt like I needed to do some major equity training and equity work on myself. And as I was redesigning this curriculum and trying to be a better instructor, develop curriculum that spoke to minoritized students, I anchored my values, or what I believe are the core principles of what I wanted this curriculum to communicate. And so 3 of the philosophers, or what I call master teachers, that anchored this work or this curriculum, these activities I'm about to show you. The first person is, or scholar, is Bell Hooks. And, you know, Bell Hooks, I came across her work when I was a first year college student. And in that experience, I remember how much she informed and validated my experience as a first generation college student, as a Latinx student, as someone that was having challenges in really navigating what a 4-year college requires of students, and specifically of minoritized students. So a couple of the principles that I walk away with from her extensive research and writing is the power of the personal narrative, and how the personal narrative, our stories, our experiences, have a place in the college classroom. Creating a safe space. So there's all this research that shows, you know, how students of color oftentimes don't feel welcomed in academic settings. So creating a safe space is so important to me. Whenever I design my curriculum, when I design my syllabus, students, I want them to feel welcomed. I want them to know that I'm there to help. Communication that's accessible to all. I'll give you guys some examples about that, but specifically, I think that historically, we at times, academics, use language that, you know, just isn't accessible, or we use policies and procedures that just don't really make sense to the student experience. So part of communication that's accessible is about ensuring that we as academics and administrators are speaking to the student experience and not just to our specialties. Systems of dominance require critical reflection. And I mean, this webinar is a micro example of that, but really creating spaces where we're dialoguing on and thinking about how we're going to be more intentional in addressing equity and equity gaps in our institutions. And, you know, finally, but not least, is the transformative power of love. Bell Hooks talks a lot about love and how that is communicated in all areas of our culture and our society. And that's something that I also try to communicate in my curriculum. The next scholar is Ibrahim X. Kendi. This is the book that Marisiko showed you earlier. Now this is a new theorist. This is the second book I've read, but I'm still learning. It's been a really good experience because it's challenged me as well in understanding equity, understanding race and racism in America. And so these are some of the tenets that I walked away with. The only way to undo racism is to dismantle it. And that's the shared responsibility that we all have, not just to address it, but to do something about it. Racism is systemic, so the importance that we recognize that systems are systems of oppression create generational oppression. It removes opportunities for students of color. And so really understanding that these structures, the way we've built them, are in place, and oftentimes are in place to keep others out and some in. And so looking at racism through systems of oppression. We've been trained to see deficiencies in people of color. This is a really critical lens. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about when we go over the assignments and the activities I use, but this is very important. Microabuse rather than microaggressions focuses on the physical and mental impact of racist assaults on people of color. And so this is really the chipping of away, right, of the spirit, when you're constantly being told messages that you're not welcome, that there's something wrong with you. Those things end up chipping away and really hurting our students. And it's a cumulative experience because these small slights or these small cuts actually leave a long-lasting impact on our students. So, before working with CUE, I already considered myself an equity-minded practitioner. I had gone through all the professional development opportunities. I was a favorite teacher on my campus. I got great evaluations from my colleagues. Tenure process is 5 years, so great evaluations, everything consistent. And then in fall of 2019, something happened. And I think there were a lot of variables, as we all know. Every semester presents a whole new set of challenges. But when I was looking at my data at the end of the semester, I realized that something wasn't working. And at the time, I was already teaching online. And so I had to really reflect on my practice. I had to reflect on every assignment, all expectations, how I grade. And that was, me dismantling, right, something or practices that might further disenfranchise minoritized students. And it was a humbling experience because as teachers, we never want to feel like we're doing anything that hurts our students. And I think that's a given. But intent isn't necessarily the same as results. So I knew I needed to look at my data and look at my results and work my way back and really reflect. And so when I met CUE, I learned so many things, and these are some of the principles that I'll talk about, or some of the values that I reflect in my curriculum. But the most valuable thing that I've walked away with is the importance of data. Data tells you a story. And it's important for you to collect that information at the end of the semester to really evaluate how effective you're being. And so when I looked at my data on fall of 2019, I realized, like, oh my God, I need to do something quickly. So, I licked my wounds and I scrapped everything and started from the very beginning. This was 8 years of putting things together, designing new assignments, et cetera, et cetera. I scrapped everything and decided to start fresh. And I built my Canvas shell and my curriculum and instruction based on the CUE's 6 principles. So the principle of demystifying, welcoming, validating, representing, creating a partnership, and deconstructing. So let me know, Marisiko, if you need me to pause or if there's anything.
No, this is great. Let's move
on.
Okay. I know we have short amount of time.
Okay. So deconstructing. So the way that I actually began deconstructing my curriculum was by looking at my data. And I decided that my data told me a very clear story, that Latinx students and Black students weren't able to be successful in my class. And so I knew that something needed to change. And I will show a copy of my syllabus, but this image that you see right here is actually the cover page of my syllabus. And it's because I created curriculum around the Charles White exhibit. In the cover page of my syllabus, I talk about my first experience in New York, which didn't happen until I was 37, and how I went into this, I went to go see this exhibit, and how it impacted how I understood myself and what do I represent and what values do I stand for. And so the whole curriculum for this class is based on the values that Charles White says informs his work as well. So for me, this is an example of decentering whiteness as a norm. The expert of my curriculum becomes Charles White, and exploring what is the value of love, what is the value of courage, what is the value of hope. It promotes awareness and critical examination of students' assumptions, beliefs, and privilege. And because the topic is something that connects us as human beings, students were really able to also self-reflect and be critical about who they are and what values they hold. And so again, we see the power of the personal narrative in the story, where they begin to feel like they have a place, their experience has a place in your classroom. It promotes critical awareness and critical examination of dominant norms and broader social inequities. And so you'll see that a lot in some of the assignments that I'll pull up for you so that you could see examples of that. But really, ensuring that they understand that there are these systems of oppression, and recognizing that that may play a role, or often, most of the time, plays a role in whether or not students are able to be successful. So the next value is welcoming. And welcoming communicates care and support. And it also establishes respect, inclusion as a class norm. So Maricico, did you want to play the video?
I want to be mindful of time. So what I'm actually going to do, no worries. I just want to make sure you have enough time. So what I'm going to do is actually share the links in the chat box so that everyone has access to view it.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay, great. All right, so what Maricico will be sending you right now is a copy of my welcome video. This is a video that I send out before the semester begins. When I was looking at my data, one thing that we learn is that we lose most students between the point that they register for your class and the first day of school. And so as a way to reach out to students, I'm an English teacher, so we know that students oftentimes have had traumatic experiences with English. And it's one of the gatekeeper courses. They can't transfer unless they pass English, their English and math. And so I send out a welcome video, basically welcoming them into my space. I film the video in my living room floor. I give them information that they'll need for the first day of school. And I also give them instructions or support on how to log on to Canvas, because our students are now all learning online. And so that's going to present a whole nother set of challenges. So really walking students in my welcoming message and letting them know if they have any questions or anxieties before the semester begins, specifically because we're teaching online, how they can reach me and ask me questions. The next value is demystify. Demystify provides students with information needed to successfully complete the course and navigate the institution. It creates classroom artifacts, syllabus, and assignments in a way that students can easily make sense of the content. So some of the links that Maricico is going to send you through chat are a video that my department made, basically teaching students on how to book office hours on Canvas. Since our students were going to move from in-person to online, it's not like they could just walk across campus and pop into your office. This was a way to ensure that students know this is how you contact your professor, this is how you can ensure that you have an appointment. And if you look at the date back in March 29, we had 191 views, and this was like a few days after we posted it. So students respond to video a lot better. And then the other video link that Maricico will send you is a remediation video, where basically I'm decoding or breaking down not just an assignment, but a skill. So this particular skill is paragraph format, and I learned from my from my data, and I learned where students were struggling, which is I wasn't making my instructions very clear. And I wasn't showing them what I want or what I was expecting from them. And so I was trying to make the remediation aspect of writing more clear. And I made a very short, it's a 2-minute and 52-second lecture video on paragraph format.
And if I can just jump in and ask if you can talk about how these videos, and in particular, the early outreach that you do with the welcome video, if you can talk about, the impact that has on the relationships that you have with students long term.
So when I was teaching on campus, I really enjoyed bumping into students that got to see my welcome video before they even met me. And I feel like that sense of community was already built, right? We were getting to know each other. I'd bump into them on campus and it'd be like, I'll see you at 2:00. I'm like, I don't know who you are, but it's probably the welcome video. And so building that community and really making sure that they knew you're welcomed in my class and I'm excited. I'm excited about this semester. I put all this cool stuff together. And by the way, here's some really important information that you're going to need. Now, when I went from in-person to online, I realized that my welcome video had to have a little bit more instructional substance. So it was about, this is how you log on to Canvas. If you're having issues logging on, these are the numbers that you should call. So it's really important to make this information very accessible and very obvious. What was your second question?
No, that you answered it.
Okay.
And I guess maybe what I'll add on is, ask as a follow-up is, for your colleagues, have you seen your colleagues start to, do similar things for their classrooms? How has this influenced the culture of your department?
Mm-hmm. So I'm in a really privileged position because I'm the chair of my department. And so I get to shepherd a lot and lead a lot and represent faculty at the same time. And so at the beginning, a lot of my coworkers were nervous because they're like, I don't want to be on video and, trying to make the video perfect and lighting. And I was like, no, you want to be yourself, And I think that once we kind of took that pressure off of ourselves and the videos were very genuine and English professors can be a little quirky, so like we were able to show those aspects of our personality, of our personalities and our uniqueness. I think that students, responded a lot better, and it became a common practice where all of our English faculty now contact students before the semester begins to remind them the first day of school is on this date. And then we've also created other types of videos. So videos explaining student rights, videos introducing, we actually have a commercial, a department commercial. So all these things have, I believe, build culture and build connection, and it's become a common practice now. Most of us just do it.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the next value is validating, and validating communicates the belief that all students are capable and expected to succeed. Now, there's tons of research about this. And the research basically shows that when students feel like they can face challenges in a space that believes in them and a space that's created for them to succeed, students, minoritized students, Black and Latinx students just tend to do better. So there are a couple of things that I do, and I'll just share a few. Our department, and that was a great question, Maricico, because this is how the department has institutionalized these equity-minded practices. So, we use social media a lot. We have a Twitter account, and we created the Twitter account actually in response to COVID, because we learned that that's what our students use, and it's quicker information, right? They get the information instantly. As the information was changing, as we were like moving from in-person to online, as deadlines were moving, we were able to communicate with students to Twitter, through Instagram, but it wasn't enough just to oversaturate their social media, which is normally an escape or where students find respite. We also wanted to provide more thoughtful communication. So alongside with, here's online tutoring, here are the hours, this is how you log on. I also created playlists for my students, especially when we were in the craziness of the transition, sending them, something where I'm not asking them for anything. Like, this is my gift to you. I've been thinking about you. And so my department ended up making it a thing. It was a practice. So every Friday, if you follow us on Twitter, every Friday we post a department playlist, and a different faculty member will create the playlist and we upload it. So we've been getting some really great responses from that as well.
Great. And we do welcome you all to feel free to add questions to the Q&A box, and we'll definitely answer them throughout. And we hope to have a little bit of a discussion at the end with what time we have left.
Okay, creating a partnership. Creating a partnership communicates a commitment to working with students for their success, and it communicates respect for students as learners. So there's a variety of ways that I do this, but in response to COVID-19 and in response to the additional challenges that our students are facing now, I have created something called, as a virtual study hall. So the way this happened was there are DJs all around the world that are having on their Instagram and actually on their Facebook as well. They're in the live feed, they're playing sets. And so they bring out their DJ equipment and they just start playing different sets. And people from all over the world get to, log in, and there's like community, and, everybody, nobody really knows each other, but, it's a virtual party. And, I wanted to create something similar for my students. And so what I did is I booked virtual study hall hours where I pull out my speaker, I put together a playlist, and I just play music, and students will jump in and out of this virtual study hall and, dance a couple songs with me and then log off, or students will come and do their homework while I'm logged on just playing music. And in the beginning, it wasn't a really great turnout. I would sit there and just no one would show up. But little by little, because I was consistent, I didn't change my practice just because they weren't coming. I knew it was going to take some time, and by the end of the semester, they were so well attended. And I was able to go over, any last minute remediation. Sometimes students just really needed to know, like, you can still pass this class. And they needed that reassurance. So I really like this. This summer will be the second semester that I do it. So I'm excited to see how it works in the summer. Representing is the next value. So it communicates the value of students' racial and ethnic experiences and backgrounds in assignments, readings, and other materials. So I've always been into creating like a multicultural curriculum using different perspectives, different authors. But part of decentering whiteness, if we're trying to be true equity practitioners, I had to look at my assignments even more closely, because it wasn't enough for me to say, I have a diverse set of authors and experts that I'm having my students read about, and write about, but I had to be even more intentional. So I created this assignment. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of study around grit. And I use two different scientists. Angela Duckworth does presents her research on like what makes people gritty. And then I paired it with Bettina Love's a piece on grit as well. And really the comparison was really created some dynamic conversations, because Angela Duckworth's research doesn't necessarily take race into consideration, at least in this lecture. Where Bettina Love says, students of color, particularly Black students, are some of the grittiest students you'll ever come across. But unfortunately, there are these other social, because of racism, right? Oftentimes that is not enough. So I had students compare both of these videos, and the stories and the examples that came out of this. I mean, it was great. The product was just amazing. And I really appreciated how comfortable they became to talk about, like, no, I don't agree with this person. And so they were able to do the scholarship work and also the affective domain.
just step in and ask you a question about this? Because I love this part of your curriculum, and I love that at every step you are really demonstrating and reflecting the values that you set forth in the very beginning. So when you choose, two women of color, Angela Duckworth, who's an Asian American woman, and Bettina Love, an African American Black woman, you are centering their voices. And even though they are sort of challenging, they're at odds in terms of their ideas, they are both being highlighted and foregrounded in this discussion for students to witness, which is unfortunately oftentimes rare. And so I'm wondering if you can also talk about, the demographics of your college that you teach at, and how do those demographics influence the decisions that you make about whose voices are represented in the curriculum?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the demographics specifically to my campus, we predominantly serve students from South Los Angeles. Those are our feeder schools. The majority of our student population at Trade are Latinx students and Black students, African American and Black students. But because Q has taught me the value of collecting data, I actually do a lot of my curriculum design now, this version of it, at looking at our equity gaps. Because if we're being equity-minded practitioners, we're looking at who are we leaving behind, and how can we remove structural barriers to ensure that we're not leaving them behind. And so this particular assignment, and there's others, but this particular assignment, I looked at our equity gap, and our equity gap where we're failing as an institution are Black students, particularly on my campus, Black male students. So I wanted to make sure that the message of you're welcomed, and I know you have something really interesting to say, and here, here's a scholar, that is talking about some of the challenges that academia, oftentimes presents or imposes on students of color, Black students in particular. That's how I designed this. So I'm looking at the data, and I'm looking at the equity gaps, and I'm starting from there.
That's great. So I think what we'd like for you all to do now is to, rethink about your values. And I, sort of leave you with this, but we were hoping that we could have breakout rooms, but we don't. So we're going to do this via chat box. And we'd love to see your responses, your thoughts, your reflections on how you will exercise agency and reflect your values in the practices that support minoritized students. So when you think about, all of the resources, which is truly just a snapshot, I can tell you based on what I know about Jennifer's courses, when you think about the resources that she's provided, in what ways do you hope to use your values to reflect that in your curriculum? What is one small thing that maybe you can do to think about your syllabus as an artifact of your classroom, and how that might, sort of reflect your values, or, your office hours, or who you choose to incorporate in your curriculum? We're wondering if we can just get some of your thoughts on that as it relates to your values. And we'll leave just a few minutes. And we actually have a lot more time than I thought. I'm so used to lots of questions coming in, or just technical questions about, well, how do you make a video, or, where do you upload, or whatever, how does Pronto work? So we welcome those questions as well. But we'll leave a few minutes here to get your responses.
So two things that, Maricico, you were talking about, one of them was about syllabus or syllabi, and then the other one was about office hours, right? So do you have a copy of, just while people are collecting, their ideas, do you have a copy of my syllabus, my Charles White syllabus? Do you have a copy?
Grab it really quickly.
While you do that, let me look at this question. This question is from Scott. Unless I misunderstood something, it seems like there was a suggestion to be sensitive to individual students' race when interacting with them. I can see the importance of that, but quite simply, how do I know my students' race in an online course? I worry that I often don't have enough information to know this. I hardly want to assume it's based on their name or from their answers on assignments. Historically, I have hesitated to use simultaneous lectures, largely out of respect for the fact that students in my online courses have very different schedules. Great question. I mean, Marcico, would you like me to tell you what I think about it? Okay, all right.
Quickly, then I can add in.
So one thing that our campus, and this is when we talk about using agency, one thing that our campus did is we really advocated to create a student system that gave students an opportunity to actually upload their school ID. So ahead of time, like I normally get the roster, I get to see like, oh, this is their major. Oh, and this student is, you know, in a specific program. And so I end up learning a lot from our students because our system now actually has their student ID on the rosters. Also, as part of my welcome video, I have them respond. I create a low stakes assignment, not something that they can lose a lot of points on, but to develop a culture in my online class. So as you know, when I send my welcome video, their first assignment is to respond. I give them the option if they don't want to do a video, you know, that's fine. Our students will oftentimes be shy, but most often they're not. They're ready to respond to you. And so they'll just use their phone, they'll use a cool little filter, and they'll respond to my request to introduce themselves. And so we begin to see what we look like, right? What is the demographic, the culture of our classroom? Our students are able to showcase their personalities. You know, sometimes I'll have students say, I was nervous, but you seemed cool. You know what I mean? Sometimes students will say like, I'm confused. The layout of your shell doesn't make any sense. So it's an opportunity to start dialogue and to really recognize who is in your classroom. So those are two suggestions that I make. You also brought up the topic of synchronous and asynchronous. So when I teach 100% online, I obviously leave it asynchronous. A lot of studies show that asynchronous instruction is better for online students because it gives people the flexibility. But we are not in the same times right now. With COVID, you're having students that would normally take an in-person class, take an online class. Now they're forced to take an online class, and that may present a whole other set of competencies that faculty need to learn. I know that's what we're experiencing on our campus, but also our students need to learn. There's a disconnect. And so what I normally do is obviously the instruction, the assignments, what I expect them to do is set up in an asynchronous way, but I record all of my lectures. Sometimes a student will hop in to my office hour and I'll say, okay, you're having a hard time with essay 1, understanding the prompt for essay 1. Would you mind if I record this conversation? Most students will say no, I don't mind. And so I'll record as I'm explaining the prompt to this one student, and the student's asking me questions. And then I'll upload that explanation onto my Canvas shell. So even though it's asynchronous, the quality of direction is similar, or, you know, yeah, similar to what would happen in a classroom where students would be like, Professor, I don't understand your prompt, you know, and I already know that that's a problem if my students don't understand it. But, you know, for the moment, that's an opportunity that I can create for them. And then the synchronous, the virtual study hall, where students get to jump in and communicate with you. Hello, I'm still here, you know, or I need help with this assignment. You begin to see who your students are as well. And then finally, your institution should have data that collects, you know, what your student population is. And again, for me, I always inform my instruction through, you know, where are our equity gaps? What students are we leaving behind?
That's great. And if I can just, you know, maybe add in, you know, more of an approach to teaching, I think that we definitely want to move towards getting to a place where we can be comfortable openly stating our positionality and how that informs our teaching practices. You know, in my classes, it is slightly different because I teach at a, you know, predominantly white institution, 4-year institution. And, you know, so the demographics are different, the social norms are a bit different. And the topic of conversation is different because I teach courses in education, and we do talk about race and gender and class and all of those things. And so it's a normal, you know, easy approach to the conversation. But I say all that to say that one of the ways that I get students to openly talk about their identity is by talking about my own. And so for me, on the first day of class, and sometimes even before I even start the class, that whether it be through email or in my syllabus, I openly say, I identify as a Black woman, cisgender, my pronouns are she, her. I, you know, arrived at this work because I grew up in South Los Angeles in a predominantly Black neighborhood. I, you know, grew up during the 1992 riots at the time when my Japanese grandmother, who is an immigrant, you know, lived there during high racial tensions between Black and Koreans in the neighborhood. Like, all of these things inform how I approach my teaching and my relationship with my students. And what I found is that in that vulnerability that I share, students are also willing to share their identities and their values and what's important to them through their assignments, through their opening introductions, when they come to office hours. It totally transforms the relationship that I have with the students. And so I oftentimes never have to look at the data, the demographic data that I receive as a faculty member, because I already know it from the relationships that I have with each student. So I really do, you know, encourage those of you who maybe don't necessarily use that as a practice. I encourage you to, you know, and I'll just say, a lot of times it's white folks who don't feel the necessity to share that. You know, when we think about gender and the responsibility of having conversations about gender, it's always placed on, you know, women and non-binary folks. When we think about race, who is raced, we think about people of color, right? But we know that white is a race. Being a man is a gender, right? And so taking the responsibility of owning up and sharing how those particular identities might inform the way that you approach your teaching, whether it informs what you know or what you don't know. And I think that, again, that vulnerability really helps. And I want to sort of align that with Jennifer's, you know, practices in her class of creating a video. That in itself, her students are able to see her face before they even arrive to class. They see who she is, how she might identify, and that takes vulnerability. I personally have never made a video for my class. I do plan to do it now that I've learned from Jennifer, but you know, I think that we have to get, you know, we have to sort of challenge ourselves to think about what is uncomfortable and why, and how we can break those power dynamics down for our students as we attempt to build stronger relationships with them.
And I mean, yes, to everything you just said, in full agreement. But just to think about it, you know, and from the lens of a practitioner, and also the principle of using agency, right? So like I said, you know, as chair of my department, I'm able to scale out a lot of these practices. And so, you know, we advocated the institution, and it wasn't easy, you know, to design an English department commercial where every faculty member, you know, had a cameo, was able to demonstrate, you know, some aspect of their personality. So we have an English department commercial introducing our department to our students. We also have, and, you know, through our social media, really putting ourselves out there, putting our music taste out there. Our department webpage has our pictures and the story of where we come from. So my bio, the fact that I was born and raised in Los Angeles, that I went to an all-women's college, you know, so those types of things, the things that I believe in. So I believe in justice, and I love this neighborhood. And so it's like really putting yourself out there, and you'll see that the response of students, you know, it's incredible, you know, and it's such a community builder. also, just from a technical perspective, on Canvas, you have an opportunity to put your bio, like where if you have your name and your contact information, the cover page of my Canvas actually has a welcome message and my bio. So students know what I look like and what I'm about.
That's awesome. We have a couple questions actually in the comment box. I can read this. I'd love for you to maybe take a stab at it and then I can follow up. How do you address, Roy Fish says, how do you address gender equity combined with racial equity? In my grad school days around 2000, I learned that more time, attention, space, and education should be given to females' voices, women's voices. Now, females make up the majority of undergraduate enrollments and on average are more successful than their male counterparts. If you give more voice to males or Black males in particular to address your institution's equity gap, are you vulnerable to being criticized for not giving enough voice to females' experiences regardless of their race or ethnicity?
Who asked that?
Roy Fish in the...
Hi, Roy. This is an actual great question. So let me start from the challenging part. When we begin to do equity-minded work, when we're equity-minded practitioners and activists and leaders on our campus, there are times where we won't get things right. Like this, me building this whole curriculum that I've just shared with you, the results of that semester, was telling me I wasn't getting something right, that the curriculum wasn't connecting with our students, that there were holes in my instruction and things that I wasn't considering. And so even though I was thinking like, yeah, like this curriculum is, represents the student population, I got this, I understand it, I went through all the trainings, I know this. I still ended up having to learn a hard lesson in looking at our equity gaps. Now, this new curriculum, I haven't piloted until this spring semester. So it's going to be interesting to see what the data is. But my challenge to you is, we have to remember the principles of what it means to be an equity-minded practitioner. And you really can't worry too much about making mistakes. You're going to fumble. Some assignments are not going to work out. And being critical about it and being reflective about it is the part that's important, that you're willing to do that. So yeah, there's a possibility that something might not work. There's a possibility that you don't get it right. But really that's not what the work is about. The work is about continuously working towards, closing equity gaps. And in terms of like the multiple forms of oppression that our students might experience, for example, gender oppression and racial oppression, again, like a lot of that, a lot of whether assignments work or not, I'm learning and I'm looking at what students' responses are. And ultimately, I think I try to find a balance in what really starting with things that our students or our community can actually connect with at a human level. And how can I make sure that those conversations or those assignments or that curriculum also looks like our students, also can help our students that are falling within the equity gaps feel included and feel represented. So it's kind of like a mixture of a lot of things. And I really won't know what's worked and what hasn't with this new curriculum until I pull that data at the end of the semester.
And I'll just add in that, it doesn't have to be an either or. That the goal really is to make sure that that everyone feels that they can connect to your curriculum, right? That everyone feels that there's a place where their voice matters. And so, but if we're going to split hairs, I think that while you might say that Black men are, a part of the dominant gender and their voices might take up space on top of women's, the reality is that Black men are a extremely, extremely low percentage of students represented in higher education. And so while they do have the sort of gender privilege and gender representation, that when you combine and when you think about the intersecting identities and the oppressive structures in particular that Black men face when it comes to what we're seeing now, police brutality, being overly imprisoned by the prison industrial system, I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that that for that reason, their voices should be included. But representation in a classroom doesn't always equate to power, right? So I'll give an example of the last class that I taught was predominantly Latinx. I actually think I had not one white student in the entire class. However, that doesn't mean that they hold all the power, right? Like I still choose who's represented in the curriculum. A lot of the conversations that we have are still very much embedded with whiteness, embedded with an absence of their voices in higher education, in the scholarship, in the research, right? And so it's important for me to still, despite the fact that they are highly represented in the classroom, ensure that they are represented in the actual work and conversations that we're engaging in. So I think that you have to go a little bit further than just thinking about data and the representation, but historically, what is the impact of how these, power dynamics play out in your classroom? And that's going to look different based on the context. So, but yeah, that's a really great question, and I'm sure other people definitely were thinking similar thoughts. I can read off a few of the comments that people have shared. Scott says, "Thank you for your answers to my question. They were stellar, and I definitely am going to put some of them in play. I think Dr. Wheaton's suggestion of being more vulnerable with an introduction that shares my positionality is appealing, as I really try to be authentic and open as a person with my students." That's wonderful, Scott. Thank you so much. And in addition, Scott says, in answer to your question, my value was intellectual charity. I think the suggested assignment that asks students to apply a critical race lens to contrast scholars' views, but also with the students' own experiences in mind, is very appealing to me. I use low stakes journaling assignments, and I see a space for using that as a prompt for my journaling activities. That's really wonderful. So yeah, I mean, that's really our goal. And I do think that Jennifer really provides some super tangible and effective ways to, to just create better relationships with students. And, obviously these things work for all students, but we know that our racially minoritized students in particular, our queer students, our disabled students, our low income students, our first gen students, all of the students who are coming from, and we know that a lot of times those things are intersected, right? Like racially minoritized students are oftentimes low income and first gen. That's not always the case, but it can oftentimes be that. And so, I really love that, you just provide people with really easy, tangible ways to break down those relationships and access what students are going through. They have so many different venues to be able to share where they're coming from, who they are, and it's with such authenticity and very little intimidation, which for me as a former community college student, I can tell you that feeling intimidated in the classroom and by a faculty member was always the number one barrier to how I was going to perform in a classroom, whether or not I felt that that professor saw me and understood my conditions, understood that I was working, outside of school, understood that I went to a very, very low resourced high school where I received the bare minimum foundation that I needed to perform well in high school. Like, to be able to have virtual office hours and to be able to have my instructor, openly share, her own experiences in education, that in itself does such a transformation for your classroom. So I'm really glad that some of you have received that same inspiration. I see Samuel saying, "I teach ethics. I was brought to tears by by the speech delivered by Killer Mike. Oh yeah, me too. A couple weeks ago in the wake of protests, I was inspired. Instead of asking students to evaluate only academic ethical papers, I have decided to ask my students to evaluate more current and relevant expositions such as his. I want to take advantage of the opportunity to hear a powerful African-American voice while my students are hopefully in a heightened intellectual frame of mind. That is absolutely so powerful. And I definitely agree, moving outside of, our traditional sources of scholarship, that is so important. Allow students to feel and express what they are seeing right outside of their doorstep. That's incredible. And so I really commend you, Samuel, for giving your students that opportunity. Jennifer, did you have anything else you wanted to share?
Do we have time left?
Yes, we do.
Okay,
I think we do, right? We have until 12:20, 12:30, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Laura. I do have your syllabus if you wanted to show that.
Yeah, do you mind just showing it very quickly, just because it went back to a couple questions, like some of the comments and questions. And then I think it ties back to this question of value. So I want to give you an example of how you can use classroom artifacts. This is something that Q has done a lot of research behind. And when I met Q, this is something that I took on as a task for myself, which is to redesign my syllabus so that it's more equity-minded. And so, I, again, already had an equity-minded syllabus, but for whatever reason, the way that it was structured, I really don't know what it was specifically. I think it might have been, it was just oversaturated with information. Students weren't reading it. And it may be that they just couldn't find the information. So in creating this new set of curriculum after fall of 2019, this is my newest syllabus. And so this syllabus is for English 101, which is a transfer level course. Every community college student has to take an English 101 if they want to transfer. And so I designed it as a literary magazine to give them, the experience of what it's like to hold a literary magazine, what it's like to read something that's in a more kind of like academic, artistic setting, not just like a document with text that goes up and down, that goes down the page. So as I mentioned earlier, the cover of my syllabus immediately is decentering whiteness. Because this was actually one of the pieces that stood out to me the most when I went to see the Charles White exhibit, but also it's just very unapologetic. And we already know that, this is going to be the culture of the class. Here are the cultural artifacts that are going to be represented in this class. And so if you go on to page 2, there's some more of my favorite pieces of the exhibit. And I have an introduction of why are we learning what we're learning this semester. And so I share my personal experience of going to New York for the first time, of witnessing this exhibit while I was there. And the quote that designed or outlined the curriculum is right there. Charles White, they asked him, what inspires your work? And so his response was, I like to think my work has a universality to it. I deal with love, hope, courage, freedom, and dignity, the full gamut of the human spirit. When I work, though, I think of my own people. That's only natural. However, my philosophy does not exclude any nation or race of people. And so the whole curriculum became about values and what is the connection between a value and what you decide to do with it out in the world. Along with that, I included a link to the artist's bio so that they can learn more about Charles White. And then also I have in my Canvas shell, I have a running playlist. And so at the end of a unit, so let's say a unit for me is 2 weeks, at the end of actually at the end of every week, they have a little tab that's titled Mood, and I upload a music video that inspired that particular unit. And I believe Maricico is going to send you an image of what that looks like. So if you could just go on to the next page, page number 3. So expectations in this particular syllabus, I made sure that the expectations were much clearer. My old syllabus just had a lot of graphics and information on top of images. And so I decided to clean it up a little bit more and make it, make the expectations more clearly. I also made sure that this version of it was ADA compliant. So using the right font, using the right text to lay out the information. And then one thing that I did that my previous syllabus didn't have is I actually have a YouTube channel where I upload lecture videos. They're really usually really short, and they normally deal with like a recap of the previous week or some type of remediation practice that I need to go over. So I included that as well so that they know that they have this additional resource. And then in slides 4 and 5, I just give a very brief snapshot of the things that we'll be talking about. So the virtue or the value of love, and I introduce the author we'll be reading. And then hope, if you look at 5 and number 5, same thing, right? The value of courage, of freedom. And so they're already looking at or getting a very quick snapshot of what's going to be coming in the course. They get to see, oh, wow, okay, this is what we're talking about. And it's demystifying, right? Like, this is what you'll be learning, and you can do this because you have a place in this discussion. Can you go on to the next slide? I restructured a lot of the common questions that I would get every semester. I restructured some of the requirements to make sure that I was addressing those questions. And I was like, you know what, I should just list them and ask the question that they're positing. So, what materials will I need? How will I submit my essays? How do I log on to Canvas? So making sure that it wasn't just my requirements, right? But it was the requirements listed, making the expectations very clear to them, but based on the questions that they have, not necessarily what I want to tell them, right? Because they need this information to be successful. I included my contact information. I ensured that I had my gender pronouns, office hours, the join the party study hall. Oftentimes students will be like, I was looking through your syllabus, which is beautiful, by the way. What is the join the party, And so that type of stuff like gets them to kind of perk up and ask really good questions. And then just, some additional information. During COVID-19 and with everything that's happening in the world right now, I think it's really important that we make things obvious to our students, make them clear and obvious. There's already too much going on. And so one thing that I changed is, along with every assignment for the week, I also included the skills and competencies that I was going to be assessing. And so again, demystifying it, telling you, listen, when you turn this assignment in, these are the 5 things I need you to concentrate on. Because there's just too much going on in the world right now. We need to make this more clear and more obvious. And so that's one thing that I did. I listed the week, what we're going to be focusing on, and the type of assignment, but also the skills that we'll be practicing. Again, some resources. So, where to get help for, if they're having any, financial aid issues, but also where to get the academic support, with the links and phone numbers, making the information accessible. If we can go on to the next page. I actually, this took some vulnerability for me because I had to share a personal story. And so, a requirement of the campus is that you put the Americans with Disabilities Act language in your syllabus. But I just didn't feel like that was enough. I mean, my experience is that students have a really hard time communicating sometimes because there's just so much stigma. And so I obviously put the legal language that I'm required by my institution to put, but I also shared a story. And the story is that I used DSPS services as well when I was in college, and that there's, this is just another tool for you to be successful. Some of the language I restructured as well on policy on academic honesty. The actual language is, is more welcoming, and it's not just like welcoming, but it's not based on the assumption that they're doing something wrong. It's just like, this is and that not that we're assuming that they're going to do something dishonest. So, the language is there and that's required. So, this is the new one. And again, the first time I've used this was in spring, the semester that we're just wrapping up. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the data tells me. I mean, I know that COVID will probably play some factor, but I think there's still a story to tell there. Like, when did I lose students? Did I lose them through the COVID transition, or was I already losing them before? Considering all the challenges that our students are facing, who was able to stay in the class and who wasn't able to stay in the class. I feel like the data will still tell a story, whether COVID happened or not. I mean, it's always important that at the end of the semester, you pull your data so that you know what's working and what's not. So I hope the syllabus example was helpful to you.
Definitely. And, I would love for you to just, as we're looking at your syllabus, I always love this part of your syllabus where you kind of give people some information on time management, and you kind of, before the class even starts, they know, okay, if I spend 2 hours of class, of work or time working, she's saying I can be successful. And I think that's really encouraging to receive from a faculty member. So I'm just wondering what your conversations with students about that have looked like, and what the coaching has been with students in your class, what it's been like.
So there's all these different studies, and practitioners have done the reading apprenticeship and the remediation and the acceleration. These are like things that, pedagogies and practices that have been kind of in place that aim to address equity gaps in the classroom. And I realized that a lot of, I'm a first generation college student, and when I went to college for the first time, there were things that could have made my life a lot easier if someone would have just told me, like, look, this is how you do it. And, having a calendar. So I think it's helpful for me to tell them this is the time expectation and I'm making it obvious to you, but I wanted to take it another level, right? And that other level is, and this is how you can ensure that you're putting in enough time. Let's make this calendar together. So even during office hours, when students call me and they're like, you know what, I'm stressed out, I don't know if I can do this. I'm like, all right, let's look at what's due in the next 2 weeks, pull out your calendar. And you have an opportunity to mentor them through practice that maybe just wasn't, obvious to them. And someone did that for me when I was a student.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's such a great service to students to receive that kind of one-on-one support that extends beyond the content of the classroom.
And, I would actually say that, when I was teaching in person, I would just get a copy of my planner and print copies and then take it to class, and and I would say, everybody pull out, grab a copy. We're going to map out our schedules, right? On how we're going to get through these next 2 weeks. I can't do that because I'm online now. So I found a digital or an online version of a calendar that's, they can go in and edit and add. And so what I would actually like to do moving forward, as I'm talking to you about this, just have like optional workshops, where I'm like, okay, so today I'll be online for 30 minutes and I'll teach you how to, plan out your assignments for the next 2 weeks. And maybe that somehow I can, look, you just gave me an idea. You just gave me an idea, because I was doing it more as an individual basis. Like, if a student would jump into office hours and say, this is too much for me, I was like, okay, give me a chance to convince you that it's not, And so we would pull out the calendar and work on it together through screen share. But I should do a workshop. Okay. Thanks, Mercico.
That's awesome.
You're a genius.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And will you be providing a copy or a sample of your syllabus as a follow-up resource?
You're asking me?
Yeah, I can't remember if you have a draft.
Yeah. So along with, I see that we're about to run out of time. So along with a sample copy of my syllabus, we're also going to send in just a sample assignment too, just so that you guys can look at how I lay things out, the instructions, addressing remediation, plus the actual assignment. And I believe also a snapshot of what my actual Canvas shell looks like, my online shell looks like. So you know, the breakdown of the assignments and the layout, you know, that's, I think it's, you know, I've worked several semesters to perfect it. And what's obvious to me, it makes perfect sense in terms of order, that hasn't necessarily meant, you know, the same thing for students. So I've played with the layout, and this is the best layout I've had so far. So I believe we're sending you all a snapshot of that as well. And then the links. So the links to the welcome video, the links to how to write a paragraph, and then also a link to how I debrief every week. So I send a quick 1 minute to video just debriefing what happened the previous week or at the end of that week. So you'll get all of that.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we wrap up, we do just want to bring your attention to the last slide, which has our contact information. We welcome you to email us, tweet at us. We definitely would love to continue the conversation. We're so grateful for the opportunity. Thank you so much. And you all stay safe during this time.
And again, you know, my Twitter account is there, my LinkedIn, my email. If you guys have any follow-up questions or any ideas, anything that this webinar inspired you to think about or do different, or idea for a new assignment, please share. I mean, I think that especially with COVID, it's really difficult to get into a room with so many practitioners. And I was telling Laura that that's my favorite part, the part where we actually get to interact with each other and bounce off ideas and experiences. So again, my email, my Twitter, my LinkedIn, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for your willingness to share in our virtual room of colleagues today. You're really doing incredible and meaningful work, and your values and your commitment to students, it just shines when you're talking and in all of the examples that you shared. And so I feel like it was a real gift that you took the time to share all of that with colleagues halfway across the country today. My cat seems to agree. So we will be in touch with you. We do want to continue these conversations and support for our faculty and staff. We will be sending out a survey, so we would love to have everyone take just a minute to fill that out. It really helps us as we are designing our next opportunities. We do have a webinar next week on using the student voice and student experience to inform decision making. That's going to be led by one of our directors of institutional research. And we are planning, actively planning additional sessions for July and August and moving into the fall semester. So with that, thank you so much, Marissa, and thank you, Jennifer. We will share out all of the materials from today. Garrett Weber will work on the recording and get that posted along with the resources. And thanks to all of our participants for taking time out of your afternoon as well to join us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.